Hey everybody, welcome back. Another episode of the Can We Please Talk podcast. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
And I'm Nick Severi.
Nicky, my boy, we're back, man. We haven't filmed an episode, it feels like, in forever for the people out there. Obviously they see an episode each week, but you and I have not talked in at least another week or so. So how have you been, my friend?
I'm good, man. I'm good. I mean, I'm grateful. I mean, we obviously text. I mean, we see all kinds of wild stuff all the time. But we were just talking about this today. Like, not recording, like your recording muscles kind of, atrophy a little bit. We haven't been on the mic and like fiending for it. That's what we were talking about getting on tonight. So I'm good, man. How are you all doing? I'm good, man. Everybody's doing good. The family's doing good. Just surviving here with everything going on in the pandemic.
Tonight's episode, Nick and I had talked about. Don't shake your head just yet. We had talked about
because people need to know. People need to know what's going on.
I think we got a pretty good episode for people tonight. We talked about this weeks ago when we had Ish Verduzco on, and the storming of the Capitol had just happened the day before. We wanted to get somebody on to really talk about the historical context of all of this, right? Like something so crazy like an insurrection at our nation's capital. But then over the weekend, you and I were texting, Nick. And the Trump impeachment trial ended on Saturday, and President Trump was again acquitted. So the first time in U.S. history that a president has been impeached twice and acquitted twice. So it's something so crazy, and we can think of nobody better than famed historian and Pulitzer Prize winning historian Eric Foner is going to be joining us tonight. He's a professor at Columbia University. He's written some fantastic books, not only about the Civil War and Reconstruction, but also about Abraham Lincoln. And I could think of nobody better to really put into words what happened on January 6, 2021.
Look at this. These protesters are inside Statuary Hall right now. You see the statues. This is a moment I never saw in my life. These individuals just rushed through security. They are inside Statuary Hall. This is a legendary place where all of us who've covered Capitol Hill, it's hard to believe what we're seeing right there. They're just walking through. Where are Capitol Police? It's an awful situation. They're having a good time in Statuary Hall. Jake Tapper, I don't know about you, but this is an incredibly dangerous situation that's unfolding here in the United States.
If you were having the equivalent of the Wu-Tang Clan of American historians in the modern day,
if that's the reference, yeah, sure.
Yeah, the Klan goes 10 deep.
Right.
Professor Foner's there. I mean, he might be the Jizza. I don't know if he's necessarily RZA, but he's there. He's in the squad, and he's with us tonight. I mean, he's up there, honestly, with Doris Kearns Goodwin, obviously noted presidential historian. You've got John Meacham, who's put out a ton of stuff, Joe Ellis. But of all these folks, Professor Foner is that dude. I mean, in matters of Reconstruction, talking about the Civil War, he's the person that I found connecting to in just terms of his books. Like, I'm currently reading Reconstruction, which arguably is the definitive text for trying to understand that period in American history. He's that man, and he's coming on tonight.
Yeah, he has written some fantastic books. You could check it out at ericfoner.com. You think about that period of time and then what's happened now and the parallels. I'm sure he's been asked this a bunch on different interviews, but it's just the parallels are eerily similar to what happened. And I would love to get, from him tonight as well, what we just talked about with the Trump impeachment. This is the first time in U.S. history, a president's been impeached twice, acquitted twice. This is the shortest impeachment trial in U.S. history. What does he make of President Trump's legacy and also Trump supporters? Because there's this stigma of Trump supporters are kind of separate from the Republican base, like almost as if they're like a third political party. And I don't think we've seen anything like this in American history. Maybe McCarthyism, the rise in the 50s, just for a brief time until Senator McCarthy was kind of exposed, during the television advent. But just so many things to talk with, Professor Foner. We are just so excited that he's going to be joining us tonight. All right, Nick, our guest tonight, we are so excited to have him. He's a former professor at Columbia University, famed American historian, Pulitzer Prize winner. He's written so many books about the Civil War, the Reconstruction, and Abraham Lincoln, and that is none other than Eric Foner. Professor Foner, Mike Leon, Nick Severi, thanks so much for hopping on with us tonight.
Oh, happy to talk to you.
Yes. We were so excited to have you on, sir, because I could think of no one better. We were talking about this off air with everything that's going on over the last couple of days with the impeachment trial, with what happened on January 6th in our nation's capital. I wanted to ask you, let's start with what happened Saturday with the impeachment trial. From a historical perspective, first time ever a president's been impeached twice and acquitted twice. The fastest trial ever in history for an impeachment. Are we going to ever see anything like this again in American history?
I think the presidency of Donald Trump has shown that things that one thought were impossible and would never be seen happened. So I'm not willing to predict that we won't have another president like this or a set of events like this. I hope not, but it's not impossible. I mean, I think one of the things we've learned from these two impeachments is that impeachment is a fairly blunt instrument for getting at what a majority of the Senate, certainly this time, thought were the real issues. That is the president's, incitement of a riot. Now, some senators said, well, you can't try a guy who's no longer in office. Some of them said, well, you have to have committed an indictable offense. But the fact is that, in our system, in most places in the world, Trump would long have been out of office. In a parliamentary system, if you lose a majority in Congress or in the parliament, you're out. And that has happened many, many times. But here, when we have a separate election for president, very often the president does not control both houses of Congress with his party, and that's fine. But impeachment, to sort of get rid of a president who is manifestly incompetent, racist, unfit for the position, there's no very clear way of doing it. And in fact, the real charges against Trump are not purely what was listed in the article or articles of impeachment. It's just general unfitness for office, but that's not an impeachable offense, it seems.
Yeah, thinking about the impeachment trial, the events on January 6th, as you're starting to do here, how does it, from a historical context, how does looking into our past better explain and sort of give us a sense of like the steps that sort of brought us here?
Yeah, well, as you said, Mike, I've spent a lot of my academic career studying the Civil War, and particularly the Reconstruction period that came right after. And, I was like millions of people watching these events unfold on TV on January 6th and more kind of shocked and alarmed at what was happening. But as commentators were saying, oh, this is not us, or this has never happened before, this is I yelled at the TV, said, no, that's not true. This has happened before. We have seen this before. Nobody alive today, but if you know American history in the Reconstruction period, you have seen mobs overthrowing democratically elected biracial governments. This happened in Reconstruction and afterwards. It's not unprecedented in our history. The Wilmington riot, 1898 in North Carolina, where a duly elected biracial government was just a coup d'etat, evicted by a white supremacist mob and driven out of office, and new people took over the city. Or go back into Reconstruction, the Colfax massacre, much more violent than what we saw. Dozens of African-American militia members were killed by armed whites, taking over the government of Grant Parish, Louisiana. The White League uprising in 1874 in New Orleans, trying to overthrow the elected government of Louisiana. In other words, we've seen this. We've seen this toxic brew of white supremacy, of hostility to actual democracy, and willingness to just use force to gain your political aims. This kind of domestic terrorism has existed at many points in American history. In Reconstruction, it was the Ku Klux Klan, the White League, groups like that. So this is part of the American tradition. It's not the only American tradition. What struck me was on that one day, we saw these events, but that morning we saw the certification or the announcement that these two new senators had been elected in Georgia, a black man and a Jewish man. And if you know the history of Georgia, you'd have to say that's a pretty remarkable thing. A state that was central to the slave system, central to the lost cause later on, anti-Semitism, very powerful there. So, you know, the historian can delineate historical precedents, but we are not imprisoned by history. People can change, you know, and that's what that election in Georgia suggested, even while all these other people are going in the completely opposite direction.
You know, I want to touch on something you said there, Professor, because I would love for you to put at least the Trump movement, and it seems like Trump supporters are now this tertiary existing political party. It's the Republicans, it's the Democrats, and then it's Trumpers. I have never seen anything like this in American politics, and I'm not that old, but maybe since McCarthyism, you heard about it in textbooks and the rise of Senator McCarthy in the 50s and how the swelling kind of grew and how he was calling out people for being communists within the party. Is there anything close to what Senator McCarthy did? Is it comparable with what the Trump movement?
Well, that's an interesting analogy, actually. It hadn't occurred to me. But I think there's some merit. I mean, yes, you're right. The Trump base or supporters, or whatever you want to call them, they are Republicans, but they're not really wedded to the Republican Party, except to the extent that Trump is the titular leader of the Republican Party. Many of them dislike the so-called establishment Republicans, the traditional Republicans. They don't feel a loyalty to the institution. They feel a loyalty to a single person. It's a cult, in my view, a cult of a particular individual. And yeah, we have had that, but much more on the state level than on the national level. Another name that pops into my mind is Huey Long, the kingfish, you know, the guy who controlled Louisiana politics for, part of the 1930s, eventually assassinated. But, Huey Long had this popular following, he was a Democrat. That was the only party in Louisiana at that time. But it was Huey Long, not the Democratic Party, that was gathering up the support. So, and then you might say George Wallace back in the 1960s, a guy who was a Democrat, a segregationist Democrat, but built up support among all sorts of people. And, showed that white nationalism can be its own political movement, which can work within parties, but is not beholden to any particular political party. So, yeah, you can find now, but what's new here is the president. Now, of course, every president is popular among his supporters. I don't care if it was FDR or Kennedy or, Obama or others. But this kind of cult of the individual is quite unusual. And now, the founding fathers did not want to have a dynastic presidency. One of the reasons they kind of thought George Washington would be a good guy is he had no children, and he was not likely to have any more children. In fact, it seems like the father of our country could not do that. Well, that's not a problem really for being president, but but we had the Bushes, we had the Adamses, we had the Clintons, but now we have the Trumps. So people are saying, well, Lara Trump, his daughter-in-law, should run for the Senate, or his daughter, Ivanka Trump, should run for something or other in Florida. So when they put themselves forward, they're just putting themselves forward as supporters of Trump, not as Republicans who are linked really to the party structure in any way. So it's an unusual situation in our political history, no question about it. There are some precedents, but probably not that many. And it does make you wonder, as a historian, I'm always interested in what people think about our history. And it's very common to say, well, we are the symbol of democracy for the whole world. We are the last best hope, as Lincoln said, or as Lincoln also said in the Gettysburg Address. purpose of the war is to preserve democracy in the world, government of the people, by the people. But now we see that there's a lot of people who don't actually respect democracy in our country. They think if you lost the election, it was stolen from you. They're willing to take up arms in order to try to prevent the counting of electoral votes. We have to be more candid about our own history and the fact that alongside this democratic tradition is a strong anti-democratic tradition, often, not always, but often linked to race and to white supremacy. And it's out there now, it's visible, you can hear it on the internet anytime you want, and it's dangerous.
Thinking about, and I'm going to sort of put you back, just getting into your wheelhouse, talking about the Civil War and Reconstruction.
Yeah.
It feels for me coming, when I was in high school, from, the end of the Civil War at Appomattox Courthouse in, 1865, from there to, Teddy Roosevelt's presidency in 1900, there seems to be a 35-year gap in terms of clarity as to what had happened in this country. And oftentimes we think of part of that period as what we refer to as Reconstruction. Professor, if you wouldn't mind just taking a moment, how would you best explain those 35 years, but also why is it that, and I pride myself on being a pretty good student in American history, but why is that feels somewhat murky, that those 35 years, the way that they're sort of
You're right. I mean, I can't argue with what you just said, and it's unfortunate for me in that I've spent most of my career just studying Reconstruction, but I can hardly claim that most people are that aware of it, although it has been in the news a lot lately. With impeachment, as you say, with white supremacist mobs, with, the 14th Amendment being discussed and things like that. In a nutshell, Reconstruction it's a time period right after the Civil War, but more important, it's a process. It's the process by which the country tries to come to terms with the consequences of the Civil War. And the number one consequence is the destruction of the institution of slavery. What does it mean that we now have 4 million people who were slaves and are now free? What is going to be their status? Are they going to have the same rights as white people, the same political rights, civil rights, economic rights? Or are they going to occupy some subordinate second-class status? Are they going to be citizens? That's what Reconstruction is all about. And in Reconstruction, you saw the creation of the first genuine democracy in American history, the first biracial democracy in which African-American men, women couldn't vote anywhere at this time, obviously, but the first male real democracy where African-American men voted in large numbers for the first time. Before the Civil War, they could only do that in a handful of states in New England, where there were hardly any black people, and held public office. My estimate is about 2,000 black men held some public office, from U.S. Senate down to Justice of the Peace during Reconstruction. And it was a political revolution, a remarkable one, put forward by African Americans themselves, demanding their rights, their citizenship, their recognition as political actors, and radical Republicans in the North. It was an biracial thing, white Republicans willing to try to overcome the legacy of racism in this country. These governments led to a violent backlash. There's no question about it. And, we know the Klan was founded in Reconstruction, and there were many other groups sort of along those lines. And eventually, a combination of violent opposition and a kind of retreat in the North, or a loss of commitment or a loss of interest, led to a waning of Reconstruction until by 1877, every Southern state was under the control again of white supremacist Democrats. So Reconstruction was over, although it didn't just end in one moment. Maybe TR, as you said, is a good ending point. The last third of the last 25 years of the 19th century was a kind of a twilight zone. Blacks could still vote in many places, still hold office, but their prospects were much diminished. The Republican Party was slowly abandoning its commitment to protecting the rights of black people. But it took a good while. And then the Supreme Court, one of the lessons here is what can happen to you under a conservative Supreme Court. And in those 25, 30 years, the court little by little whittled away at the laws and the great constitutional amendments of Reconstruction, the 13th, which abolished slavery, the 14th, which created birthright citizenship and equal protection of the law, put the concept of equality into the Constitution, and the 15th, which was supposed to guarantee the right of Black men to vote. Supreme Court let those things be abrogated or just ignored in the South for a long, long time. I'm giving you here a long lecture on Reconstruction, but I'll just say that one of the lessons of that history is that you can't take your rights for granted. Rights can be gained, rights can be put in the Constitution, but they can also be taken away from you. And we're seeing that today. See, the thing about Reconstruction is we are living in it in a way, or we're living with the issues of Reconstruction now. Who should be a citizen? That's a Reconstruction question.
Right.
Who should have the right to vote in this country? That's being fought over in state. That's a Reconstruction question.
Right.
How do you deal with domestic terrorism? That's a Reconstruction question. What about economic equality along with political equality? In other words, you can't understand American society today without knowing something about Reconstruction, even though a lot of people probably don't.
Right. Well, I want to stay on education because obviously you're a former professor. Nick has worked in education for 20 years. What do you make of our education system? We've seen the 1776 project that came to light recently. We've seen teachers in different states, and there's been viral clips of teachers taking things out of context or teaching people different things with regards to slavery, et cetera. As a former professor, what do you make of what's happened to our education system over the last, let's say.
I think we don't devote enough resources to education of any kind. The basic problem with history education in this country is that there isn't enough of it. Yes, there are some people who are teaching a very old-fashioned, distorted history, but there's actually a lot of good teachers out there too. I don't want to just say, all history teaching is no good. That's not true. I've spent a lot of my career as a college professor lecturing to conventions of high school teachers. I used to run a seminar every summer for high school teachers from around the country about how to teach the Reconstruction period. I've written a textbook which is widely used in high school history classes. There's a lot of good teachers. The problem is states. We got 50 different state education systems in this country, and a lot of them don't really respect history, especially lately. It's STEM. We've got to teach them technology. We got to teach them engineering. We got to prepare them for jobs in the future of, so they can create better dating apps or whatever they're going to be trained to do. So therefore history becomes a luxury. And in fact, the No Child Left Behind system, which Bush began and Obama continued really, it makes history a kind of an outcast. Your schools that have a lot of resources can teach history and teach it well. Schools that don't, their funding is based on students' test scores in math and science, math and English. Where's history? Doesn't matter. If you teach history, you're actually taking away from teaching them for the test that's going to determine if your school has money or not. So there's just not enough history education. Now, yes, of course, history has become politicized. It's a combatant in the culture wars. You have the 1619 Project, which the New York Times put forward, which, had flaws like anything else, but I think was a very serious effort to move beyond a lot of mythology about American history. And then President Trump, just before he left office, came up with the 1776 Project, which was to restore all this mythology as best they could. Luckily, that kind of sank beneath the waves once Trump was out of office. But the real problem, as I say, is there just should be more emphasis on the teaching of history. I'm in New York State. I'm not sure where you guys are. It doesn't matter. We're on Zoom, right? But, in New York, you can go through all of high school and not get a full year of American history anymore. And that's ridiculous, in my opinion. So we need to do more for history education, no question about it.
Yeah, I know a bunch of history teachers that would agree with you.
Yeah, I have a lot of friends in the education sector, obviously, and they will be very excited when this episode gets pushed out because it confirms a lot of things that we've all known in the field. I would add to what you were saying, civics education. We do romanticize wars oftentimes, that the process of how these things.
Yeah, that's right. But I remember, I'm old enough. I'm old enough to have had civics in high school. I grew up in Long Island, suburbs of New York City. I still remember my civics class, and that's not what we need now. I mean, my civics class, we learned I still remember how a bill becomes a law. Someone introduces it, a committee in the House, blah, blah, Lobbyists, never mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Members of Congress having to raise money from corporations and how that affects legislation, never mentioned. You learned the whole structure, but you actually didn't learn anything about how the system really operates. So I'm not saying that's not what we need now. We do need civic education, but we need civic education about what it means to be an engaged citizen in this country, in a democracy.
Well said.
How do you change things for the better?
I want to direct something I remember reading in the introduction to your book on Reconstruction was this idea of changing schools of thought. And you talked about the Dunning School, and what was the understanding of Reconstruction in that period. Professor, if you could just take a few minutes, and I know you don't like to make yourself the point here, but I'm going to make you the point. From that change of thought, though, from one viewpoint to your contribution to this discourse, what was the shift from the Dunning School to what you were putting forward and to others?
Well, the shift was number one, the Civil Rights Revolution. The Dunning School, I have a complicated relationship to the Dunning School because Dunning was a professor at Columbia University long before me, around 1900. But in other words, I'm his successor as the guy who teaches the Civil War era at Columbia. And in fact, the history department has a Dunning Fund, which gives little grants to professors. Like when I was doing research, I could get a grant. I got to travel for a week to some place to go to the archives, and the Dunning Fund would pay my airfare. And I always thought that was kind of ironic because I'm traveling around trying to destroy this guy's view of history, and yet the Dunning Fund is financing it. But, the thing is, it tells you about the study of history, and in some ways it doesn't tell you a very pleasant thing about it. The great link, in a sense, between the Dunning School and what I and other people did more recently is W.B. Du Bois's great book, Black Reconstruction in America. And the final chapter of that book is called The Propaganda of History. We've heard about fake news a lot lately, but there was this fake history. And it's a commentary on our profession, I'm sorry to say, that for years they spewed out fake history. That Reconstruction was a total disaster. It was the lowest point in the whole American saga. It was a period of misgovernment and corruption. Why? Why was that? Because Black men were given the right to vote. That was the great era of Reconstruction, according to that view. Because Black people just simply can't, they're not capable of exercising democratic rights intelligently. And that was that wasn't just an academic analysis, that was part of the legitimation of the Jim Crow system in the South. If you say, hey, wait a minute, they took the right to vote away from Black people, they should give it back. And white Southern, no, we can't do that because look, we'd have the horrors of Reconstruction again. This was a justification for subordinating Black people because of what they supposedly had done during Reconstruction. And as I say, it's an embarrassment to our profession as historians that this is the role historians were playing. Not every single one of them, but a lot of them in the 1920s, in the 1930s, in the 1940s. In the 1950s, you could find this in textbooks, in law cases. Chief Justice Rehnquist, back in 2004, published a book about the election of 1876, which ended Reconstruction. And Rehnquist's book was based on the Dunning School. That's the Chief Justice of the United States in 2004, long after no reputable historian would say that anymore. And yet there it was, and it affected his interpretation of the laws and constitutional amendments.
Professor Foner, I wanted to ask you something, because given how much history you have studied yourself personally, obviously you've won a Pulitzer Prize, but does everything feel connected in terms of all these events, or have you seen something and been like, oh, I've never seen that before? Like just in the president being impeached twice. I've never seen that before. Did you ever think you would see something like that?
We saw Andrew Johnson impeached once, and Andrew Johnson was a sort of precursor to Trump, actually, as a guy who played on racial hostilities and, you know, was so egomaniacal that he thought that no one else mattered, you know, and the first president to be impeached. And one of the complaints against him was inciting a riot. The New Orleans riot of 1866, the Memphis riot, where white policemen led a mob to assault the black neighborhood in Memphis. You know, Black Lives Matter. It's not new that policemen use violence against black people. That happened in Reconstruction and was one of the things that led to the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. But history doesn't repeat itself. A lot of things, I'm always saying I've never seen this before. I don't believe that we've heard it all or seen it all. And even though we like to create analogies between different time periods and different processes, as I say, we're not trapped in history. We can make the decision to move beyond it. And I hope as a society, we will be able to do that.
Professor, I'm just shifting gears to think a little bit differently. Obviously, you're a noted history professor and a award-winning author. If the history thing didn't work out, though, what would you feel like you would have become? Where would you have seen yourself?
Political analyst is my guess.
You know, when I went to college, I was not a history. I didn't want to study history, even though my father was a historian. I knew a lot of history, but I was a physics major. I wanted to become an astronomer. I was a kid growing up. I had a little telescope. I'd put it on our lawn at night and look up at the moon or whatever. I was very interested. I'm still in science. As I say, that's my second love. And maybe now that I'm retired as a historian, I can start out getting another degree in astronomy. I never got my degree because here's what happened. In my junior year, I took a year-long history seminar on the Civil War and Reconstruction with a great teacher at Columbia, a guy named James Shenton. And a great teacher can change your life. You know, taking that course inspired me to change, to become a historian and to study that period. Now, this was the height of the civil rights era. And a lot of us wanted to know, where is this coming from? Where there are thousands of people in the streets every day. You know, where is that coming from in American history? The history we had been taught couldn't have produced what was happening in the streets. So there was something wrong with that history. The history that had told us that all the problems of America were solved and, there was nothing more to be done. Suddenly it seemed there were some problems that needed to be addressed. So, I changed, but a lot of people did. A lot of people started. And then what did I study? My dissertation, my first book was about the anti-slavery movement. I wanted to know, how did they change things? How did you actually use politics to get rid of slavery? That's a pretty big thing to accomplish. So my point is that the present always affects the history. It gives you the questions you're interested in, not the answers. The answers don't come out of the present, but the questions do. And those questions about how you change things for the better have been inspiring my writing of history ever since.
Professor Foner, I can't tell you what a treat it was. Not only that you just said all of that, and for all the history teacher friends of mine that are going to be giddy over that, but thank you for all of your work. You can check out ericfoner.com for all of his books. Wherever books are sold, go get one of my favorite books, The Second Founding. And like I said, a former professor at Columbia University. We appreciate your time tonight. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Very, very nice to talk to you guys.
All right, that was noted American historian, Pulitzer Prize winning historian Eric Foner. Like I mentioned, check out ericfoner.com. You can check out all of his books wherever books are sold. He's written so many great books about the Civil War, Reconstruction, Abraham Lincoln. Nick, there's a lot there, man. I mean, I love some of the things he said about, the education system in America, the lessons that we're still learning. He talked about his childhood and in the 50s and 60s during the Civil War and seeing people march in the streets. And it's like, how come I didn't learn about this? And it sounds eerily similar to what's happening in 2020 and 2021, man. There was so much there with Professor Foner. What'd you make of the interview, man?
For one, I feel validated. I mean, I think I've said this to you forever. 50 states, 50 different views of education. It's why there's no way to have really. It's a struggle now to try to have a unifying discussion around history. I really appreciated how Professor Foner talked about just the need to have more of a thrust around history education. Right. More resources being dedicated to it, more time being dedicated to it, less around STEM or standardized testing. I mean, these other things that are in place now, and we're missing opportunities to have really rich conversations. Honestly, today we talked about stuff that just really was put in a way that just felt accessible to anyone who's going to listen to the show or catch video clips. Obviously, we hope to just take a period of time that maybe you may not have been paying attention to in history class and really blow it up. I mean, he
was great. Listen, he said something because I went to school in New York State throughout my entire life, and he said something about, you could go a year without having American history. And now I'm remembering back. It's like, I had it in 10th grade. I had it in 11th grade. I didn't have it senior year. I don't remember having American history, at least some type of class freshman year. So it's funny that he mentioned that, but I just thought he's been doing the rounds, recently. You've seen him everywhere, from CNN to a bunch of other different places, Face the Nation. I think he was on one day. And it's just, everybody wants, when something happens that's unprecedented, right? It's like, well, who can we get that knows history? And he's the go-to guy, man. And there's just so many things there. I can't stop thinking about the education part of it, because we've talked about it. We talked about it with Professor Dyson. You and I talked about it in the education episode. There's just so much of education being under attack in this country, and it's underfunded. Professor Dyson talked about, they don't have a problem defunding education. They don't have a problem defunding schools, right? So there's just, I just love that he gave those answers. But for you, I feel like when Naveed came on in the television episode and he said everything that I told you happened at Fox, you must feel the same way in terms of the education space. So he was great. As always, for our podcast folks, so you're going to check out this episode. Nick's hitting the YouTube smash button down below.
Come on, man.
Listen to us across Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher. Leave us a comment in the App Store section. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
We out here, everybody. I'm Nick Severi.
That's right, baby. All right. We'll see everybody next time.
Later.